right, we're about to read chapter 10, and I'm going to go ahead and present to you a few words that you're going to come across in this chapter. We're going to come across the word crock, and it refers to a container made of a ceramic that's kind of a little bit more rough ceramic than fine china. These are some crocks. We're going to come across the word sluice gate, and this is a picture of a sluice gate. The idea is water is draining out from somewhere, and the gate is channeling the water in the way that the designer of the sluice gate wants it to go. Okay, so it's something blocking the flow of water in like a ditch. Okay, this horse is ramping. So to ramp is for the horse to buck back and put its front feet up. And then the word cordial, it was used at times as like a type of medicine or something to a syrupy type consistency liquid that could be, a medicine. Okay, so those are some words you're gonna come across in this chapter that aren't very common to us here. So chapter 10, the spell begins to break. Now, we must go back to Mr. and Mrs. Beaver and to the three other children. As soon as Mr. Beaver said, "There's no time to lose," everyone began bundling themselves into coats, except Mr. Beaver, who started picking up sacks and laying them on the table and said, "Now, Mr. Beaver, just reach down that hand. Here's a packet of tea, there's sugar, some matches. If someone will get 2 or 3 loaves out of the crock over there in the corner." "What are you doing, Mrs. Beaver?" exclaimed Susan. "Packing a load for each of us, dearie," said Mrs. Beaver very coolly. "You didn't think we'd set out on a journey with nothing to eat, did you?" "But we haven't time," said Susan, buttoning the collar of her coat. "She may be here any minute." "That's what I say," chimed in Mr. Beaver. "Get along with you all," said his wife. Think it over, Mr. Beaver. "She can't be here for a quarter of an hour at least." "But don't we want as big a start as we can possibly get," said Peter, "if we're to reach the stone table before her?" "You've got to remember that, Mrs. Beaver," said Susan. "As soon as she's looked in here and finds we're gone, she'll be off at top speed." "That she will," said Mrs. Beaver, "but we can't get there before her whatever we do, for she'll be on a sledge and we'll be walking." "Then we have no hope," said Susan. "Now don't get fussing, there's a dear," said Mrs. Beaver. "Just get half a dozen clean handkerchiefs out of the drawer. Of course we've got a hope. We can't get there before her, but we can keep under cover and go by ways she won't expect, and perhaps we'll get through." "That's true enough, Mrs. Beaver," said her husband, "but it's time we were out of this." "And don't you start fussing either, Mr. Beaver," said his wife. "There, that's better. There's 5 loads and the smallest for the smallest of us. That's you, my dear," she nodded, looking at Lucy. "Oh, please do come on," said Lucy. "Well, I'm nearly ready now," answered Mrs. Beaver at last, allowing her husband to help her into her snow boots. "I suppose the sewing machine's too heavy to bring?" "Yes, it is," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great deal too heavy. And you don't think you'll be able to use it while we're on the run, I suppose?" "I can't abide by the thought of that witch fiddling with it," said Mrs. Beaver, "and breaking it or stealing it as likely as not." "Oh, please, please, please do hurry," said the 3 children. And so at last they all got outside, and Mr. Beaver locked the door. "It'll delay her a bit," he said. And they set off, all carrying their loads over their shoulders. Here's Mr. Beaver helping Mrs. Beaver get her snow shoes on, and the packages they're saving to take. The snow had stopped and the moon had come out when they began their journey. They went in single file. First Mr. Beaver, then Lucy, then Peter, then Susan, and Mrs. Beaver last of all. Mr. Beaver led them across the dam and onto the right bank of the river, and then along a very rough sort of path among the trees right down by the river bank. The sides of the valley, all shining in the moonlight, towered up above them on either hand. "Best keep down here as much as possible," he said. "She'll have to keep to the top, for you couldn't bring a sledge down here." It would have been a pretty rough scene to look at through the window from a comfortable armchair. It would have been a pretty enough scene to look at through the window from a comfortable armchair. And even as things were, Lucy enjoyed it at first. But as they went on walking and walking and walking, the sack she was carrying felt heavier and heavier, and she began to wonder, how was she going to keep it at all? And she stopped looking at the dazzling brightness of the frozen river with all its waterfalls of ice, and at the white masses of treetops, and the glaring moon and the countless stars, and could only watch the little short legs of Mr. Beaver go pad, pad, pad through the snow in front of her, as if they were never going to stop. Then the moon disappeared and the snow began to fall once more. And at last Lucy was so tired that she was almost asleep when walking the same time when suddenly she found that Mr. Beaver had turned away from the river bank to the right and was leading them steeply uphill into the very thickest bushes. And then she came fully awake and she found that Mr. Beaver was just vanishing into a little hole in the bank, which had been almost hidden under the bushes until you were quite on top of it. In fact, by the time she realized what was happening, only his short, flat tail was showing. Lucy immediately stooped down and crawled in after him. Then she heard noises of scrambling and puffing and panting behind her, and in a moment all 5 of them were inside. "Whatever is this?" said Peter's voice, sounding tired and pale in the darkness. "I hope you know what I mean by a voice sounding pale." "It's an old hiding place for beavers in bad times," said Mr. Beaver, "and a great secret. It's not much of a place, but we must get a few hours' sleep. If you hadn't all been such a plaguey fuss when we were starting, I'd have brought some pillows," said Mrs. Beaver. It wasn't nearly such a nice cave as Mr. Tumnus's, Lucy thought. Just a hole in the ground, but dry and earthy, and it was very small, so that when they all lay down, they were all a bundle of clothes together. And what with that and being warmed up by their long walk, they were really rather snug. If only the floor of the cave had been a little smoother. Then Mrs. Beaver handed round in the dark a little flask out of which everyone drank something. It made one cough and sputter a little and stung the throat, but it also made you feel deliciously warm after you swallowed it, and everyone went straight to sleep. It seemed to Lucy only the next minute, though it was really hours and hours later, when she woke up feeling a little cold and dreadfully stiff, and thinking how she'd like a hot bath. Then she felt a set of long whiskers tickling her cheek and saw the cold daylight coming in through the mouth of the cave. But immediately after that, she was very wide awake indeed, and so was everyone else. In fact, they were all sitting up with their mouths and their eyes wide open, listening to a sound which was the very sound they'd all been thinking of, and sometimes imagining they'd heard, during their walk last night. It was the sound of jingling bells. Mr. Beaver was out of the cave like a flash, and the moment he heard it. Perhaps you think, as Lucy thought for a moment, that this was a very silly thing to do. But it was really a very sensible one. He knew he could scramble to the top of the bank among the bushes and brambles without being seen, and he wanted above all things to see which way the witch's sledge went. The others all sat in the cave waiting and wondering. They waited nearly 5 minutes. Then they heard something that frightened them very much. They heard voices. "Oh," thought Lucy, "he's been seen. She's caught him." That was great was their surprise when a little later they heard Mr. Beaver's voice calling to them from just outside the cave. "It's all right," he was shouting. "Come out, Mrs. Beaver, come out, sons and daughters of Adam. It's all right, it isn't her." This was bad grammar, of course, but that is how beavers talk when they are excited. I mean, in Narnia. In our world, they usually don't talk at all. So Mrs. Beaver and the children came bounding out of the cave, all blinking in the daylight with earth all over them, and looking very frosty and unbrushed and uncombed, with sleep in their eyes. "Come on," cried Mr. Beaver, who was almost dancing with delight. "Come and see, this is a nasty knock for the witch. It looks as if her power is already crumbling." "What do you mean, Mr. Beaver?" panted Peter, as they all scrambled up the steep bank of the valley together. "Didn't I tell you," answered Mr. Beaver, "that she'd made it always winter and never Christmas? Didn't I tell you? Well, come, just come and see." And then they were at the top and did see. It was a sledge, And it was reindeer with bells on their harnesses, but they were far bigger than the witch's reindeer. And they were not white, but brown. And on the sledge sat a person whom everyone knew the moment they set eyes on him. He was a huge man in a bright red robe, bright as holly berries, with a hood that had fur inside it, and a great white beard that fell like a foamy waterfall over his chest. Everyone knew him because though you see people of his sort only in Narnia, you see pictures of them and hear them talked about, even in our world, the world on this side of the wardrobe door. But when you really see them in Narnia, it is rather different. Some of the pictures of Father Christmas, or Santa Claus in American culture, in our world make him look only funny and jolly. But now that the children actually stood looking at him, they didn't find it quite like that. He was so big and so glad and so real that they all became quite still. They felt very glad, but also solemn. "I've come at last," said he. "She's kept me out for a long time, but I have gotten in at last. Aslan is on the move, and the witch's magic is weakening." And Lucy felt running through her that deep shiver of gladness which you only get if you're being solemn and still. "And now," said Father Christmas, or Santa Claus, "if for your presents there's a new and better sewing machine for you, Mrs. Beaver, I will drop it in your house as I pass." "If you please, sir," said Mrs. Beaver, making a curtsy, "it's locked up." "Locks and bolts make no difference to me," said Father Christmas. "And as for you, Mr. Beaver, when you get home, you will find your dam is finished and mended and all the leaks stopped and a new sluice gate fitted." So in this case, the sluice gate is going to allow him to let some water through the dam or not. Mr. Beaver was so pleased that he opened his mouth very wide and found he couldn't say anything at all. "Peter, Adam's son," said Father Christmas. "Here, sir," said Peter. "These are your presents," was the answer, "and they are tools, not toys. The time to use them is perhaps near at hand. Bear them well." With these words, he handed to Peter a shield and a sword. The shield was the color of silver, and across it ramped a red lion, as bright as a ripe strawberry at the moment when you pick it. The hilt of the sword was gold, and it had a sheath and a sword belt and everything it needed. It was just the right size and weight for Peter to use. Peter was silent and solemn as he received these gifts, for he felt that they were a very serious kind of present. Solemn does mean like serious and a little bit, not sad, but a little bit calm and thoughtful. "Susan, Eve's daughter," said Father Christmas, "these are for you." He handed her a bow and a quiver full of arrows, and a little ivory horn. "You must use the bow only when in great need," he said, "for I do not mean you to fight in the battle. It does not easily miss. And when you put this horn to your lips and blow it, then wherever you are, I think help of some kind will come to you." Last of all, he said to Lucy, "Eve's daughter." And Lucy came forward. He gave her a bottle of what looked like glass, but people afterwards said it was made of diamond, and a small dagger. "In this bottle," he said, "there's a cordial made of the juice of one of the fire flowers that grow in the mountains of the sun. If you or any of your friends is hurt, a few drops of this will restore them, and the dagger is to defend yourself at great need. For you also are not to be in the battle." "Why, sir?" said Lucy. I don't know, but I think I could be brave enough." "That is not the point," he said. "Battles are ugly when women fight. And now," here he suddenly looked less grave, "here is something for the moment for you all." And he brought out, I suppose from the big bag at his back, but nobody quite saw him do it, a large tray containing 5 cups and saucers, a bowl of lump sugar, a jug of cream, and a great big teapot, all sizzling and piping hot. And then he cried out, "Merry Christmas! Long live the true King!" And he cracked his whip. He and the reindeer and the sledge and all were out of sight before anyone realized they had started. Peter had just drawn his sword out of his sheath and was showing it to Mr. Beaver, when Mrs. Beaver said, now then, don't stand here talking till the tea's got cold, just like men. Come and help carry the tray down and we'll have breakfast. What a mercy I thought of bringing the bread knife." So down the steep bank they went and back to the cave, and Mr. Beaver cut some bread and ham into sandwiches, and Mrs. Beaver poured out the tea, and everybody enjoyed themselves. But long before they had finished enjoying themselves, Mr. Beaver said, "Time to be moving on now." And that's the end of chapter 10. So, some exciting things are happening. One of the witch's powers was to keep it always winter and never Christmas. And the fact that Santa Claus, also known as Father Christmas in England, has come is showing that Christmas has come. Now, we know that is just a symbol of the gifts that were given to Jesus, right? So we have Santa Claus giving gifts, just like the wise men gave Jesus gifts. And when we celebrate Christmas, we celebrate the true meaning of Jesus coming to earth. But sometimes it's fun to do a little Santa Claus. So in this book, Santa Claus represents the coming of Christmas and her not being able to keep out Christmas anymore, and the power of the witch getting lesser and lesser. So see you later for chapter 10. Chapter 11. We just finished chapter 10.